So building science part 2, as we can see in this opening introductory slide, some water damage, certainly some water damage, moisture damage, what appears to be mold or at least fungus growing on the back of sheathing, an attic where it's been basically lacking of ventilation, and certainly we have moisture being generated or at least dumped into this attic space, and we can see the damage it's creating to the sheathing. The image to the left with the bathroom and the shower area, those are two little electric heaters trying to dry out this wall. A good attempt, but we can see again what we talked about in part 1 about the main principles. We're talking about moisture and air movement in and out of the building envelope, that outer, we'll call it, layer of the building. The dew point occurring inside the wall, in this case, exterior wall. We can see the window off to the right-hand side with again, the photo to the left.
Well, with that, so I'm just looking at it. So there's a shower head on the left-hand side with the bars. Yep. So obviously, was this a shower stall?
This was a shower stall, and it's basically the shower stalls have been removed, as we can see here.
Right, and so then you have, I see your studs, which are, then you have the plastic. So you have the stud, you have this drywall. So then you can use, cement board or anything of a moisture resistance.
No, it appears that it was all at the time gypsum board.
Yeah.
And it was one of those plastic insert shower type stalls.
Okay.
And we can see here the signs of the wet fiberglass insulation still to some degree adhering to the wet back of the exterior sheathing.
Jeez.
So again, we can see that, here's evidence of both, I guess it could be either moisture coming through the sheathing itself or the dew point because of temperature difference occurring inside that wall. The stud's look in pretty good condition, as even the bottom plate there. So we can see that certainly they caught it not later than sooner, but at least they caught it before it caused a lot more damage to the wood framing. The one in the lower right, I like to call that a fungus until it's been actually tested, or some type of fungus type material. But anyways, likely development of mold happening again on the back of sheathing. So again, we see signs of moisture basically traveling through the sheathing or into the wall cavity. And we see the development here of this mold growth. The attic itself, what we see, there's actually a black vent pipe for the plumbing system that doesn't go through the roof. It's basically, we'll call it spewing moist air from the plumbing system up into this attic space. What we see is a bright yellow insulation there, and what they've done, people thought that maybe if we stuff the insulation into that overhang, we can save energy. Well, really what they did is by stopping the ventilation, they actually created a bigger problem. Sometimes trying to do it the wrong way, in this case, proves to be a detriment or a problem. And we can see the moisture damage to the wood sheathing, to the rafter, and certainly we can see where even the white kind of mildewy type mold has developed on the sheathing. So again, examples probably help provide some, we'll call it substance or backup to what building science is all about. Again, we're going to talk a little bit here about air requirements. We started and actually ended with air requirements in our last session. So that's why I put the word continued there. We talked about construction of tighter houses often resulted in higher interior humidity and air pressure differential. So when we talk about this, If moisture finds a cool surface inside the wall cavity, or in fact, in the inside of the structure in general, it can condense, leading to mold growth. This can happen in the winter when a house is pressurized and warm, humid indoor air passes into a wall cavity and condenses on the cold sheathing or the siding. So we've seen some examples, the previous slide, and once again with this slide. Again, if we take a look at it, the text in red here is homes become more airtight, which is really where the building codes have gone. They must have a good ventilation system to provide adequate air exchange. And certainly ventilation isn't the only thing. Last time we talked about sealing up the joints or the holes or the gaps in the construction that happen to occur. So better sealing of that outer building envelope, or we'll call it layer to the building. So again, we see more damage here. Photo to the left, water damage in the back of the sheathing on a truss roof system. Damage to a house that's been raised, and certainly you can see wood rot, again, destroying a lot of the wood in the lower portion of the house. And this photo I thought was kind of one of those, I guess back in my days, I used to belong to a camera club, something I thought was kind of unique. Just creating, you can see all those moisture droplets and the damage done to this back of this particle board sheathing. So it was one of my photo moments. While we're on the topic, I thought it would be important to talk a little bit, especially for those in the field, about tools. What do I use as a home / building inspector? Some of my tools out of my, we'll call it toolbox. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about tools that are sort of things I would use in the field when I'm doing an inspection or a review. Now, typically home inspectors do what's called a visual inspection. Maybe you also do the same thing, primarily using what you can see and trying to diagnose what you think is going on. But there are times when you might want to think about some of the tools that are out there that you can use to basically validate your findings. So if I start to the left-hand side, this is my infrared thermometer. What would I use an infrared thermometer for? Well, a number of things. Well, I can basically use a little yellow trigger and basically point it towards a wall, especially an exterior wall, and get a temperature reading, maybe at a few different spots and locations. In that viewing area on the back of it's going to give me a temperature reading. I can set it to centigrade or Fahrenheit. Probably something similar to what I guess some people in the nursing and I guess medical profession use nowadays to take our temperature to see what kind of temperature we might be running, off of our forehead. Okay, moving on to the next one. One of my popular ones that I use because it's what's called a contactless moisture encounter. And really what we can see here, because it's turned off right now, it's at the scale of the lower end towards 0. And if it goes up towards 14, it changes into yellow. It gets upwards towards the end of the yellow, 16. And then it keeps going from there. Above 20 gets into the red zone. I can use it, as I mentioned, for a number of different things. So it's contactless because it has 2 little pads on the underside. And like it's laying on my desktop here, you can see it could actually take a reading, and it has 3 different scales. I'll give you an idea of some of the cost of some of these tools later if you're interested. The next one over, that third one, is what's called a damp detector. And you'll notice there's 2 little stubby pins on the top. So basically what I'm going to do is just put those pins, and it's going to make conductivity, because all of these, by the way, are battery operated. Basically, it'll make a connection between the 2 points and give me a damp detection reading. And along with it, it has a sound alarm. Well, from a very quiet sound to a much noisier, intense sound when we're looking at dampness. So it's a high audio output, high damp reader. The next one over, that fourth one, or the one with the yellow graph, basically bar with that bright yellow test button, there's 4 pins on it. So you can see the ones, number 3 and number 4, both have pins on it for basically taking a reading. So that's why the first one was called a contactless. It doesn't have those pins on it. Well, the fourth one basically has a scale. You can see going from 6% up to over 25%. And what I can do is I can take that and basically, I won't say stab it into the wood, but make contact with the wood with the 4 pins, and it'll give me an accurate moisture reading in any wood. So a wood moisture meter. Of course, there's a test button to make sure it's working. The last thing there is a humidity / temperature gauge. And what I do quite often is I set that up and I basically do my inspection, do a walk around, and find an average temperature and humidity reading in the house. So these are little tools that you can take your sort of inspections to the next level when it comes to, let's say, not just simply visually looking at something, but actually testing to verify that it actually is happening. As an interesting case, John and I were talking about, a new construction and what type of tools would they use to test for the moisture content of wood. My first choice would be new construction is to use the one with the 4 pins. So again, just trying to give you some general idea of what's out there. Okay, so if moisture finds a cool surface inside the wall cavity, it condenses and can lead to mold growth. So this can happen in the winter when a house is pressurized and warm, humid indoor air passes into a wall cavity and condenses on cold sheathing or siding. So when we think about this, again, it's just to try and give you a general idea about some tools. For example, that moisture encounter runs roughly about $500. The very first one, you could probably pick it up. In fact, I think I bought that one at Canadian Tire for about $75. The Bionaire on the far end I think was about $50. And the other two are in the range of, depending on the quality and the models available, you can probably buy them at $75 and upwards. So just to kind of give you some idea of cost. Ice damming. Okay, what is an ice dam? Well, basically, ice dams can be prevented by a combination of proper attention to ventilation and insulation at the attic overhang space, that overhang at the outside wall. So what we saw earlier in a couple of or at least one of the photos we saw where they stuffed the insulation into the overhang, not a good idea. Usually what you want is vented soffits to let air flow through even in the winter. Because what happens is what we're now doing is we have a heated space with a lack of movement, which means an ice dam forms. So heat loss into a roof and attic assembly during the heating months can lead to ice damming. It can be caused by a lack of thermal insulation or too much, or the fact that simply it can't breathe, that overhang. So we need ventilation. Most often it's caused by locating heating and cooling ductwork. So in some locations, depending on where the heating and cooling ductwork is, if it's in the attic, again, it's not a good spot for heating and cooling. And we'll talk about the heating and cooling aspect a little later. Well, certainly a solution is to not locate the ductwork and heating and cooling systems in vented attics, and certainly making sure that the overhang is ventilated. Here's an example of an ice dam to the left, the bright yellow wood siding. Looks nice, but we see an ice damming forming on newer construction. That's a sign that we have ice damming occurring. Okay, it can get a lot worse than that. I've seen a lot worse than that. But when we take a look at the image to the left, we can see some of the causes of the ice damming. So I mentioned about, okay, the air leakage, possibly around a lighting fixture, so air leakage spot, potential for a heat duct being located in that space, or the heat loss by conduction through possibly a finished attic space. Well, as the snow melts, it creates a water, and the water will tend to eventually refreeze and create this ice dam, as we can see in it's very telltale signs. It's the icicles. Well, what damage can it cause? Well, get the insulation wet. It can cause basically what we might see again as one of my visual clues is cracking or damage to the ceiling upper wall area. Why? Because, well, water is going to cause eventually damage to the finishes of the inside. Eventually, maybe even cause the wet insulation in the wall to actually settle. And certainly it can cause deterioration to the soffit and certainly to the siding itself. So again, a lot of things that we want to do is we actually want to get that ventilation. If I just kind of put my arrow here, air traveling up, over, and through into the space. So we'll see here the insulation is basically stuffed towards the outside, pretty much making contact with the back of the sheathing. So that's ice damming. Ice dams can be prevented, as I mentioned, by a combination of proper tension, ventilation, and insulation at the exterior overhang, that wall detail.
Actually, Claude, I have a picture, because remember I had bad ice damming. I'm going to see if I can share one of my pictures. Share. Can you see that?
Yep.
Yeah. So I have the A-frame, and I had really bad ice damming, so I had access to my attic. And Keith suggests I get the pink insulation, screw it into the side, and then go around with a gun and make sure there's no leakage from the edges. So I had to do that on this wall here and along the sides. And that's and I was getting bad ice damming down in here. And
So you did
it stopped by ice damming.
Yeah, so that's basically what, just like a foam type, a caulking sealant type spray foam?
Yeah, spray foam for for air gaps. Yeah, there was on sale and I got a bunch of cans and had a party.
Just don't get that stuff on your skin. It's not fun to try.
I did. Oh yeah, I got it everywhere. So, but then I used the tape here. I was going to use duct tape, but he said to use the foil tape because it holds and won't disintegrate with the heat.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just thought I'd share that. So how do I stop sharing? Oh, there you go.
Okay, stop sharing. Good.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Back to you, I think.
Okay. Am I still there or?
I don't see. There you go.
Okay, I think I'm back.
Yeah,
Okay.
Good.
Okay, another one. What I like to talk about is not just what happens outside, but sometimes we need to think about some things that actually happen inside the house. So when we think about, some people call it ghosting. I noticed on CMHC, they like to call it dusting. I don't know. But anyways, what is ghosting or dusting? So what we take a look at, we talk about ghosting and dusting. Probably some of you may have seen this or heard about it. So wood has a lower thermal resistance than insulation when we think about the outside of the house, that exterior wall. So more heat will flow and will occur through the external framing members than through the insulation. This can result in this condition, often indicating visual signs as streaks of dirt uniformly spaced that correspond to the framing location. The cause of this the cause is actually thermal bridging in the framing members and in contact with cooler interior surfaces. So there are a number of places where this actually can occur. So we can see discoloration of carpeting along the bottom outer, we'll call perimeter of the house if you have carpeting. It is common on interior gypsum board surfaces at exterior walls. Sometimes you can even see it with electric resistance baseboard heating. Sometimes you'll notice some dusting or some darkening of the wall area just above the heating baseboard itself. And really what it is tiny particles that become aerosolized or launched into the air and remain airborne for many minutes or hours. Well, some other causes could be smoking, candles, the fireplace, a wood stove, anything that generates some type of, we'll call it almost like a dirt or soot that can become airborne. So let's take a look at it. Over to the right, we see two examples, two photographic images. If you've ever seen this, this is what is ghosting. So we can see in the lower right side, we can see where every stud is in this wall construction. In the upper one, we can see where every, we'll call it ceiling joist occurs in the ceiling. So let's take a look at ghost stains on exterior walls, this little detail off to the left-hand side, this image. So again, no insulation at the edges of the wall studs makes edges and fasteners cooler. Black soot stains deposit on cooler surfaces with a ghost stain, is what they call it, outlining the studs and usually the darker nail heads. So again, this is kind of an image here to kind of portray what actually is happening is this ghosting. So the soot outline on the studs. Now, it's not going to happen right away. It's going to take, living in a house for a little while for this to occur. So we can see here, for example, we have an R13 plus insulation or an R3 at the stud edges. So again, you have to think about R13 is the insulation value and R3 is the actual wood stud. Well, we can see that the higher the R value, the better it is at thermal energy, transfer as far as saving heat. R3 is very, very low, certainly better than a metal stud or a steel stud, but it's certainly a huge difference in the insulation value is what we're looking at. So this is what occurs with ghosting. Another thing I like to talk about and let people know that's, again, part of building science we have to think about. Certainly there's a lot of different things we can think about with building science, but certainly the next one I wanted to touch on is truss uplift. What is truss uplift? And, well, let's put it this way. Basically, wood moves, drywall does not. So we can see in the picture here to the right, or the photograph, we can see this large gap in the ceiling. And there's the wall, the upper part of the wall, and we can see this crack occurring. Well, often this is going to happen in, they call it a truss uplift because primarily it happens with wood trusses. Excuse me. So truss uplift occurs because the moisture content difference between the upper chord and the lower chord of a wood truss. For those that might not be familiar with, okay, this is the upper chord. Okay, it's sort of the shape of the roof. And this is the lower chord, this one that becomes basically the ceiling joist coming across. And what happens is temperature difference. Warm air going up into the attic space, cool ventilated space here, cold. So we have this temperature difference. And depending on the insulation, if you insulate a wood roof truss, the lower chords will be warm and the upper ones will be cold. So a crack forms at the central wall ceiling intersection, and that's what we see here in this photograph here. So truss uplift, occurs When the top cord of the truss expands, well, the bottom cord contracts due to this change in the humidity and temperature difference, thus causing the cracking. Well, what often happens is what we see as a large gap becomes a smaller, more hairline gap, usually back in the summer when things kind of settle down again. The temperature is more even.
So just a question there from Lane. What can be done to prevent ghosting?
That's a really good question. What can be done to prevent ghosting is more insulation on the outside, because basically what we have to think about is, if we go back to this image, if we imagine the wood sheathing on the outside, it's better to actually have, we'll call it rigid insulation, because this wood to wood contact creates the thermal bridge, a weak spot. We can beef up the amount of insulation on the outside to reduce the transmission of heat loss through the stud. So the heat transfer is the issue. And basically, we know insulation typically is going to provide us with a higher thermal insulation value. So again, part of it falls back into, it depends on how the house is being built. As an example, on my home, when I built it, I have 6-inch walls on the exterior. I have rigid insulation with basically it's a Thermax sheathing, which actually has aluminum facing on it. Tape joints, so I have my air barrier. Souped up insulation as sheathing on the outside. More insulation in the wall, and no problems like this happening. So it goes back to the design and construction. So again, it becomes an issue of maybe how the houses are actually being built.
We addressed ghosting as well, and so we're about to launch a series of technical guides for building in northern housing. And we talk about the issue of ghosting and the importance of insulations, and in some cases, double walls and moody walls, which are more known for out in the Yukon area. But we spent quite a bit of time on ghosting and insulation requirements. And so insulation requirements for Southern Ontario, well, so where Claude lives, is different from where I live in Ottawa, and is totally different than the Arctic and subarctic areas as well. So we talk about that and ghosting. So
yeah, so one of the major things is good points, John, is the fact that how we insulate and how we build. Certainly there's better ways to build, we'll say, in colder climates than in where I am down in the balmy south. That, like John said, there's even a big difference between Ottawa and Windsor. Okay, so truss uplifts. The next one was mechanical duct chases. Often another area that we need to consider inside of the house is it really good to use joists or studs for ductwork? Does it rot the framing? Or is it a spot where moisture can actually penetrate? Well, I say, well, really, why? Because this is pretty common practice. So, for example, this is on one of my home inspections. We can see over here on the far right this foil-faced ductwork return. And we see over here in the ceiling several runs of the same type material. Well, over here we see a nice round traditional metal ductwork for heating. Well, this is, we'll call it the cheaper method of trying to create movement of certainly on a forced air system, either supply air or in this case return air. The problem is it's a nice material, it's fairly flexible, but as it says here, air will be sucked from any leak available to equalize the pressure. So are we actually now creating another area just because of the way things are built in a condition like this, that moisture can actually sit in this area and basically get moisture into the wood. Over here, the moisture is going to be in a round ductwork. It's going to be in the metal. Worst case is the metal possibly rusts. The best thing we want to see actually is all the joints are sealed and fastened. Here, if we take a look at, there's sort of little dimples where they've nailed this to the wood stud. Again, same thing would occur here in this floor joist, because this is basement with floor above. So mechanical duct chases, do they become another potential area? So leaky ducts certainly should be sealed wherever and whenever possible. On the other hand, most people wouldn't want to give up using a clothes dryer, which is also responsible for accidental ventilation, moisture generation into a house. Because think about the heat and moisture generated when we use a clothes dryer. How is it ducted? How well is it ducted? And certainly we know that it's got a lot of moisture in it.
So on the clothes dryer, I know sometimes, and I even did it at my place in the wintertime, I revent it inside to keep the moisture in. And in the summer, I put it out, but now it's out, especially with a gas dryer.
Yeah, I mean, if we go to the local hardware store or lumber yard, we probably can pick up a unit where we can basically allow that a device to open and basically add some, we'll call it moisture or humidity in the air because it's so dry in the winter.
Yeah.
And certainly when the weather gets kind of nicer and the heat and humidity starts building up, we want to get it vented certainly to the outside.
But is it recommended? Not really.
It's not recommended, but do people do it? Hey, my next door neighbor has it. I was thinking about it.
Yeah.
You know, you start thinking, well, you know, I'm running a humidifier in the winter. Maybe I can kind of do a cheap fix by adding this little gadget that I can pick up at the hardware store and start introducing some moisture for a lot less cost than the humidifier. Ventilation. When we talk about ventilation, certainly we need to think about a couple of types of ventilation. Certainly the attic needs to be ventilated. I mentioned that earlier. The other area that we need ventilated quite often, depending on the building system that's being used, is the lower area below the floor. So the crawl space, indoor, in some cases, the basement. So when we think about ventilation, aside from the natural ventilation in spaces, like I mentioned, such as the attic crawl space, it's required for occupant health and safety. We need air exchange in the house. So it's become common practice nowadays, especially with the building codes, that an HRV, heat recovery ventilation, or ERV, energy recovery ventilation, is becoming the norm. They have the advantage of not only ventilating to the outside, but also capturing the heat from the exhausted air, that stale air that's being, we'll say, ventilated or pushed out and exhausted. The heat can be transferred to the fresh air drawn from the outside to temper it, especially in not so much freezing weather, but certainly some weather, colder weather, and provided for use in the home. So when we start taking a look at things such as the codes or standards, the CAN CSA F326, it's based on a number of different factors. So is it on the number or types of rooms in a house, or is it based on the building code requirements? And both are kind of, we'll say, kind of cross paths with each other, maybe in a good way. So the National Building Code, NBC, requires principal ventilation system capable of continuously ventilating at a rate governed by the number of bedrooms. One's by people, the other by basically rooms and spaces. And it is to protect against depressurization and air pollutants. And certainly all we have to think about is when my wife maybe is cooking some fish, that smell can linger for a while. We don't need to talk about bathrooms because we know that we can also generate different types of moisture and certainly odors that can come from bathrooms. So these things are really sort of make up air for exhaust devices. So for example, if we're basically pushing air out, exhausting air out, we need make up air coming in. So this is where the things such as the HRV and ERVs become generally fairly efficient at doing that. In some cases, the mechanical contractors, at least down in my area, will say, well, you really don't need fans if you got an HRV, my bathroom fan, and so on. But I actually have both in my house. The other thing too is, what about carbon monoxide detectors? Thinking about carbon monoxide, certainly we're going to talk about issues such as how do we detect, the spillage of combustion gases potentially into the house. The other thing we need to think about with fans is certainly the airflow and the SON or the noise ratings. So again, some things to think about inside the house, that building science isn't just about just the outside. We need to think about also what's going on inside. So when we think about indoor air quality, problems of poor indoor air quality, moisture, and poor chimney function are typically not due to tightness itself, but rather a failure to look at the house as a system. How do we get these things out of the house? How do we get better air into the house? Okay, with tight construction, healthier building materials, controlled ventilation, and direct vent appliances. So for example, water supply, so water heating, hot water, heating systems, etc. Sealed combustion heating devices. You can have a tight house and you can also have good indoor air quality. So it depends on the system that's in the house. So I indicate here that maybe some symptoms of poor indoor air quality may be the obvious: mold growth on the walls or the musty smell. Or others may be the less obvious, such as the radon gas or those suspended particles in the air. Well, we talked about the suspended particles in the air creating the ghosting as an example. Again, going back to some basic building science. So again, everybody may have different susceptibility or comfort level when it comes to the health and systems of the occupants within the house. Again, some strategies: indoor identifying the source, improving ventilation, improving air filtration. Again, I like to throw in some more photos. Okay, here's another toolkit that I use. It's called the IAQ, Indoor Air Quality Air Survey Kit. What you see here, basically ignoring this is just a meter to check the operation of this. So it's really just a voltage detector. What we have here over to the right-hand side is, this is a pump. The pump basically takes one of these tubes here, these air tubes, and basically is going to check the air inside of a house. It's going to do an air survey. You'll see there's 4 of them there. So typically, depending on what a person wants to pay me to do an air survey, what they're going to do is, this pump is going to basically capture and suck in the air from within the house and test it. Usually what you want to do is, you also want to do, probably your primary test is the first one outside, and if you're doing 4, 3 inside at various locations. So what happens is, there's this paperwork, so tube identification, and there's a thing called chain of custody, which means, Claude handled it. It hasn't been, we'll say, altered in any way, sent off to the lab, Prism in this case. And basically what we do here is do the testing. Well, an air quality test probably can range $400 to $500, depending on the amount of actual testing that's done. So again, just to kind of give you an idea, This whole kit here is about $1,000, just to let you know. And then you have to buy these refills, obviously, after each home you're going to test. So you basically going back to the company to buy their tubes. You ship these off, and they're basically tested, and you get a report indicating. I think it was well over 100 different compounds they can detect from that air sampling. But just to kind of give you an idea. So problems of poor indoor quality, moisture, and so on. When we think about it, there are means, and that's why I wanted to show you a little bit about some of the tools that are fairly typical out there. It doesn't have to be this one. This happens to be the one that I use, but I thought, well, let's take some photographs and show people. There's also another side to the building science, and that is the testing and basically finding the results, the reporting side. So the pump is designed to be used, collect air samples, and basically what it does is they're going to give you a report based on the analysis of what's in these tubes, so the findings. Moving on to combustion appliances, what we want to think about is the hazards that may be associated with any type and all types of appliances. So any heating system that uses fire and or flue or a chimney can backdraft. We already talked about that. Backdrafting occurs when the combustion gases that should normally rise through the flue reverses and flows back into the house. So again, a number of different sources. So we generally assume most appliances are reasonably safe, and most are reasonably safe. Again, it depends on the conditions within the house. A few more tools. Well, here's a few more tools I want to talk about: a gas detector and a thermal imaging camera. Over to the left-hand side, you'll notice this red one is what I call my gas sniffer or gas detector. That, again, just to kind of give you a ballpark range, is in about $300 to $400 for that, and it goes up from there. So what it does is I basically trigger it. There is that little round button for sensitivity, and basically what I'm going to do is go around gas pipes or anything that is a fuel base that may be feeding into, for example, my furnace, forced air gas furnace, and do some sniffing to see if there's any carbon monoxide or gas leaks. Next to it, a little hard to see because it's on a dark background, is my thermal imaging camera, the old gun style. And over to the far right is the new one, this one little box here attached to basically a smartphone. This is in the range of $2,000 versus about $500. So even thermal imaging can be done on a smartphone for companies such as FLIR. These are both FLIR units, the company. And as we can see in the lower image, it gives us an idea of this is what we see with our visual eyes. This is what we see with the thermal imaging camera. What it tells me, does this area look wet? You cannot see it with the naked eye. Doesn't look wet to me. But look what happens when we use a thermal imaging camera. What I see here is we see cold spots. These dark spots are likely moisture accumulation or possibly water penetration. So again, I would suggest that if you're going to invest in thermal imaging, certainly there are courses available to help you get a better understanding of what you see. The other thing it does also is you can see the different coloration from 69.2 Fahrenheit up to 78 degrees Fahrenheit. So again, temperature swing differences, the color coding. So when we take a look at the unit is ideal for pinpointing leaks up there for gas leaks, and the other for verifying potential hidden areas such as what the thermal imaging camera can pick up. I mentioned earlier about that one little unit at the very, very beginning that measured temperature, and it's probably in the range of, say, $75. It can basically be pointed towards the wall or ceiling or floor or other object and basically detect temperature, similar to this, but it doesn't give us the thermal imaging. You can see here over to the picture to the left, the thermal image, those are wood studs. Wood studs. But wood studs, but it looks like with a different color to it, which means is that moisture traveling through and possibly bypassing the window. The moisture condensing, falling down here and getting wet to the base of the floor here, the base floor area, and so on. So just to kind of give you some idea. John talked about a little bit about climate differences, the difference in climate between, we'll call it the extreme north and also Ottawa, or in my case, Windsor. We'll call it the balmy south of most of Canada. So one of the most important effects of things we need to think about is the climate and its impact on our perceived body temperature, which is all about human occupant comfort. But there's also another side, and that's about what John also mentioned about how much insulation. So air temperature, thermal comfort are affected by sun, wind, precipitation, and certainly our comfort level in a house or building. So air temperature impacts thermal comfort of occupants in general. Again, the diagram is generally too hot or too cold. It never seems to satisfy everybody all the time. So therefore, we end up with those, well, sometimes I like to call them the thermostat wars. Turn it up, turn it down, and whatever. We can see here in the winter, we have heat escaping out through the attic space, which gets back to the problem with moistures in the attic. And in the summer, we have the opposite. We have the hot shingled roof in many cases, and a very hot attic space, which is tending to warm up the interior living environment. And we have to think about ventilation and cooling. And we're also going to be talking about temperature degrees and certainly Fahrenheit or Celsius. This next slide here is indoor design temperature. Where does it come from, and why do we need to know about design temperatures? Well, the building codes dictate that typically in different spaces, such as shown in this particular image, what is required for different spaces. This is building code, I guess, stuff. So when we consider the heating system, it should be designed to maintain the inside design to a certain temperature. So for example, a finished space, 22 degrees centigrade or 72 Fahrenheit as a minimum. Heated crawl spaces, attached garages, sunrooms, etc. So again, these all come out of building code, which gets us to the next slide. This is a 1995 data sheet out of the National Building Code of Canada. And what I like to talk about is differences in temperature and degree days. I compare actually I'm going to compare three locations here. Ajax, which is just near Toronto, and it has, if we go up here in the green box, degree days. You'll see over here in the red box, design temperatures. The red is winter, July, summer. How much rain, how much snow, how much wind, how much seismic, which is earthquake, is designed for a specific. So this is all code speak. So what we want to do here is Ajax 4,000 degree days. Well, degree days we'll talk about in a minute. I just want you to look at the numbers. Winnipeg, 5,900, an increase of 1,900. And I say, well, let's take a look at something really farther north, Churchill, Manitoba, 9,200 degree days. What we're talking about, the number of degree days is talking about the amount of heating required, therefore the amount of insulation required to think about when we start designing houses and what is required to keep that 72 degrees Fahrenheit inside the house. Certainly there's other factors, like I say, wind, snow, other factors. But what we're talking about for the building envelope, for the most part, is this. This is what our map looks like, roughly, when we talk about different zones for heating degree days. This is what basically the mechanical people, the heating and cooling people look at when they're supposed to be designing a heating system for a house. So heating degree days provides a means for comparing the temperature and heating requirements of a similar building in different locations. So you can see I'm way down here at the kind of the tip, Windsor. John's up here in Ottawa. Change of color. We come up here. Look at, he's in zone 6. I'm in zone 5. Well, there's only one area for zone 4, and that's Victoria. Well, in most of BC, the lower mainland and part of the upper island, certainly zone 5. But what about zone 8? Yellowknife. How about Edmonton or Winnipeg? We can see, well, Winnipeg certainly represents a much higher requirement for insulation in a house than me way down in Windsor or John in Ottawa. Or even more so, what about Yellowknife? So in summary, let me wrap it up because we're getting near that time. The building science may not be your expertise when it comes to diagnosing and considering the relationship of the house as a system. We talked about the house as a system to start off with. There are unseen conditions that are beyond the general recognition of the visual inspection. I talked about what we could see, but I also showed you a little bit of what we can detect by going the extra step with some inspection tools. You know, some things to look at things a little differently. I call it using my X-ray vision like Superman did, or the super person did. We know now that a number of conditions related to building science that are connected to the conditions encountered. So just to kind of indicate here, most molds need a surface moisture content of about 20% to begin growth. Typically, it's 19% or lower lumber should be. 20%, well, it starts to create mold. It can be controlled by controlling air moisture levels and minimizing condensation. And this includes proper site drainage and damp proofing, because we didn't really talk too much about that outside of the outer skin of the house. The use of soil covers, vapor retarders, insulation, and ventilation as ambient conditions call for. So when we think about this, I hope that you've gained some knowledge about building science. I wasn't trying to turn you into a building science expert, but we can also see here that we've hopefully given you a little bit of knowledge about building science. So again, just to sum up the credits, there's been a lot of different information from different sources that I helped and used to put this together. They're listed here. One I recommend that you take a look at is one called Building Science. If you're really looking at the building and you want to look at this, Building Science has tons of technical papers on lots of things, ventilation, crawl spaces, you know, and there's some building science videos. So again, I thank you very much. And John?
Yeah, we have actually a question that I think was answered, but so Curtis mentioned we have a renovation project here in Tananagua. Our carpentry team wants to remove the window and install a 3-piece tub surround over it. It's a good idea. There is a HRV and exhaust fan. I don't think it's a good idea because the washroom shows signs of moisture on the walls or ceilings. But Peter responded and said, you need to remove the bathroom windows and replace with insulated exterior walls. This is common practice if you have HRV ventilation systems.
Yeah. Definitely when I hear, or I guess look at the exact thing is certainly remove the window. Certainly it should be insulated. But also at the same time, if it's possible, is even before things get too far along, is it possible to remove even portions of the wall finish to make sure, or at least use some type of tool such as that thermal imaging camera to see if there's something happening beyond. Even something such as the moisture meters will help detect it, and certainly you don't have to spend $2,000 for the that gun style thermal imaging camera. You can use the a smartphone with that thermal imaging adapter that can give you that result. Of course, the other one is to use the moisture meters, and that's why I thought it was important to show some of the tools, especially for those out in the field. It gives you that extra level of I hate to see something we'll say renovated or fixed and find out all you've done is put something on top of something that's already damaged that you're going to have to tear apart later.
Yeah. Okay. Before we go further, I just want to go through some of our webinars. There is a little bit of a method to our madness on all these webinars that we put together. Claude and I went through, a couple of weeks before how best to organize this. So, and that's why we start with the building science, because we have a really great presentation by probably one of the top experts, Claude, moisture management, Gord Cook.
Yeah.
And very familiar with, he's done a lot of work from coast to coast to coast in a lot of the communities. Then we have another one of Indigenous Home Innovation Initiatives. They're talking about some passive housing. Then we get back into framing. And then we get into telespections and use of videos and photography, because this has been a hot topic, mainly because of COVID. They can't do inspections. So how do you inspections vis-a-vis cameras and photography? And then we're into, again, back in the HVAC. So that gives you up to June. So fairly low those first several webinars. So if there's no other questions or comments, if you need to have a comment, turn on your camera. I'm just seeing here. If not, we are good to go. Any wrap-up points there, Claude?
Yeah, I was going to mention, you mentioned Gord Cook. Certainly Gord Cook has a great presentation. In fact, there's several coming up. But if you basically look into Gord Cook, Cooke, he has some interesting building science videos also about energy management, and certainly things like the moisture and heating and cooling. So again, good cross-referencing, because although we present some of the information, sometimes people like Gord will come at it from a little different angle, which means, guess what? You get a different opinion and more information to help you. So thank you.
Yeah. All right, everyone. We will send out on moisture management for Thursday. So enjoy your day and on Thursday. Thanks, everyone.